To be a royal outcast is a peculiar kind of hell. It is not a public execution. It is a slow, silent death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's the averted glance in a palace hallway, the unreceived invitation, the cold, polite shoulder from your own blood. And for Princess Beatrice of Saxe-Coburg in Gotha, this was her entire life. Born a granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria and Russia's Tsar Alexander II, Princess Beatrice was a product of 3 empires, yet she died a pariah, cast out by 2 of Europe's greatest courts. Her crime was committing the ultimate sin. She became a scandal. Banished from Spain by her husband's king and shunned in England by her cousin King George V, she was the German relative and separated wife the new House of Windsor wanted to erase. This isn't a fairy tale. It's the story of a princess who rebelled for a great, passionate love and lost everything: her home, her fortune, and her reputation. This is the story of Baby B, the princess abandoned by all. To understand Beatrice, we must first understand the unique, almost multi-personality world she was born into. The late Victorian era, the 1880s, was the absolute height of European monarchies. It was a world of seemingly unshakable power, where bloodlines were the tendons that held the continent together, and at its center was Beatrice's grandmother, Queen Victoria. But Beatrice's family was not a quiet, purely English branch of the family tree. Her father was Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, Queen Victoria's second son. He was a sailor prince, a man of the world, and by all accounts a difficult, melancholy man who grew increasingly alcoholic. He was the Queen's favorite son, but also her disappointment, a man with musical talent and naval prowess, but lacking the warmth of his elder brother or the erudition of his late father. More importantly, her mother was Grand Duchess Marie Alexandrovna of Russia, the sole surviving daughter of Tsar Alexander II. The Grand Duchess was no woman to be trifled with. She was fiercely intelligent, fiercely proud, and fabulously wealthy. When she married a member of the British royal family, it was out of a sense of superiority, not gratitude. The most famous story about her is that when she arrived in England, she immediately caused a mini diplomatic crisis. She demanded priority over the Princess of Wales. Her reasoning? She, as the daughter of an imperial Tsar, superior to Alexandra, who was only the daughter of a king of Denmark. She lost that war. Queen Victoria had to intervene, but it shaped her character. She found the British court dull, the weather terrible, and the rules oppressive. She wrote letters home to St. Petersburg, complaining about everything from the food to the lack of cultural sophistication. This was the family Beatrice was born into in 1884. It was not a typical English royal family. It was a grand, multilingual, continental court in miniature. Her mother ran it with an iron will and a Russian sensibility. The family did not live primarily in England. Beatrice's early years were spent in Malta, where Prince Alfred was stationed with the Royal Navy. It was a life of sun, sea, and imperial pomp, a curious mix of British naval strictures and Russian imperial luxury. Beatrice and her sisters grew up speaking English with their father, French with their mother, and German with their tutors. They were truly international children. Then in 1893, when Beatrice was 9, her world changed forever. Her father's uncle, Duke Ernst II of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, died childless. According to the will of Prince Albert, Alfred's father, the throne of this small German principality would not go to his eldest son, the future King of England, but to his second son. Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, renounced his British titles and place in the line of succession. He became the current Duke of a sovereign German state. In an instant, Beatrice was no longer just an English princess. She was now essentially a German princess. The family moved to Coburg, the capital of the duchy, and settled into Ehrenberg Castle. For her father, it was a heavy task. He was an Englishman to the core, now ruling over German subjects he did not truly understand. He sank deeper into drink and melancholy. But for her mother, Grand Duchess Marie, this was the moment she had waited her entire life. She was finally a reigning duchess. She was first lady of her own court, far from the judgmental eyes of her English relatives. She was the absolute ruler of Coburg, and she had raised her daughters with one purpose in mind: to make brilliant marriages into the great royal houses of Europe. It was a world of boundless privilege, but also of stifling pressure. It was this gilded cage, half English, half German, and run with a Russian spirit, that forged the passionate, beautiful, and ultimately tragic Baby B. The foundation for Beatrice's fateful rebellion was laid by the example of her older sisters. Princess Beatrice, known to her family as Baby B, was the youngest of 5 children, and by many accounts the most beautiful. She and her 3 older sisters, Marie, Victoria Melita, and Alexandra, became known throughout Europe as the Coburg sisters. They were renowned for their beauty. Portraits of them, painted by leading artists such as Philip de Laszlo, show young women with an almost otherworldly grace, with deep, soulful eyes, and a distinctly un-English charm. Their mother, the formidable Duchess Marie, had big plans. For her, marriage was a strategic game. The eldest sister, Marie, was affectionately known as Missy. Born in 1875, Missy was a radiant, romantic, and strong-willed beauty. In 1893, at the age of 17, Missy made what was considered a spectacularly successful marriage to Crown Prince Ferdinand of Romania. It was a perfect game. Romania was a new rising kingdom, and Ferdinand would soon be king. Missy, with her beauty, intelligence, and Anglo-Russian royal blood, became the center of Bucharest society. She would go on to become the legendary Queen Marie of Romania, a major figure in World War I, a diplomat, a fashion icon, and a legend in her own right. To Beatrice, then a little girl, Missy was a role model. Expectations. It's the path of duty. You get married by arrangement, you play your role, and you become great. That's success. The second sister, Victoria Melita, or Ducky, was born in 1876. Ducky was a storm. She was passionate, stubborn, artistic, and perhaps the most beautiful of all. She had the beautiful violet eyes of the Romanovs and an unyielding spirit. And her life taught Beatrice her most important lesson. Their grandmother, Queen Victoria, had special plans for Ducky. She wanted Ducky to marry her first cousin, Ernest, Grand Duke of Hesse, who was Ernie. He was the brother of the other Hesse princesses, Ella and Alex. Queen Victoria believed that this marriage would unite the 2 branches of her family. Ducky and Ernie objected. They had played together since childhood. They knew each other too well. There was no romantic spark. But Queen Victoria, in her old age, was becoming authoritarian. She gave orders, and Ducky's mother, Duchess Marie, agreed. It was a good marriage in terms of status. The wedding took place in 1894 in Coburg. It was a royal affair. Queen Victoria attended. At the wedding, their other cousin, the future Tsar Nicholas II, formally proposed to Alex of Hesse. But amid the general joy, Ducky's marriage was a disaster from the start. Ducky finds life in Darmstadt, the same court that Victoria's mother once found stifling, deadly dull. She finds Ernie a boring, passionless husband. They have a daughter, Elizabeth, but the marriage remains frosty. The problem ran deeper. Rumors spread throughout the European courts. It was whispered that Ernie had no real interest in women. Modern biographers and contemporary letters indicate that Ernie was almost certainly homosexual or bisexual, with close relationships with male writers and courtiers. For Ducky, a passionate, romantic woman, it was hell on earth. She was trapped in a loveless, sexless marriage with a man she couldn't connect with. She wrote to her sister Missy that she disgusted her husband. She dutifully did like Missy, but instead of a crown, she got prison. Stranded in Darmstadt, Ducky began looking elsewhere for love, and she found it scandalously with another first cousin, Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich of Russia. Kirill was the complete opposite of Ernie. He was a Romanov, tall, manly, a naval officer, and he was infatuated with Ducky. And Ducky was infatuated with him. They began a passionate, clandestine affair right under the noses of their entire family. It was an act of unimaginable recklessness. Ducky, a German Grand Duchess, was having an affair with a Russian Grand Duke, third in line to the Russian throne. When Queen Victoria died in January 1901, Ducky felt liberated. She was no longer afraid of her grandmother. That same year, she did the unthinkable. She publicly announced her divorce from Ernie. All of Europe erupted. Divorce within the royal family was almost unheard of. It was a scandal of the highest order. Tsar Nicholas II was furious. He considered Ducky's actions a personal affront to his family. But Ducky didn't care. She divorced Ernie in 1901. She then fled to be with Kirill. The Russo-Japanese War broke out, and Kirill, as a naval officer, miraculously survived after his warship was mined and sank. That near-death experience made him determined. In 1905, Ducky and Kirill ignored everyone. They ignored the Tsar, they ignored the rules of the church, and they got married in Coburg. Tsar Nicholas II's retaliation was swift and brutal. He stripped Kirill of all his titles, ranks, and pensions. He expelled them from Russia. Ducky and Kirill had become outcasts, like Beatrice would become. They had no home, no income, and were shunned by the entire court. But, and this was the key point, they had each other. They were in love. Beatrice, with the passionate character of the Coburg family, has decided her path. She will not accept a boring arranged marriage. She will fight for love, just like Ducky. Before she met her destined husband, Beatrice experienced a tragic first love affair, an event that foreshadowed future tragedies. She fell deeply in love, and once again it was with a cousin. That person was Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich of Russia, Misha. This was no ordinary infatuation. Misha was the youngest brother of Tsar Nicholas II. And because the Tsar and Tsarina Alexandra had no sons for many years, Misha was, for a long time, heir of the entire Russian Empire. He was one of the highest-ranking and richest men in the world. He was also a gentle, charming, and handsome man. He visited Coburg and was completely captivated by the beautiful Beatrice, Baby B. And she loved him too. This was a dream come true for Duchess Marie. Her youngest daughter marrying the Russian heir. It would be the ultimate triumph, surpassing even Missy's marriage in Romania. Beatrice and Misha exchanged letters. They planned a future. It seemed like a perfect match, a union between two branches of the family. But there is one obstacle, one steel wall that even their love cannot overcome: Russian Orthodox Church. Like the Catholic Church, the Russian Orthodox Church has strict rules about incestuous marriage, and they prohibit marriage between first cousins. Ducky and Kirill were married outside church, causing a scandal. But Misha, as heir to the throne, could not do that. He needed the Tsar's permission. Beatrice and Misha pleaded. Duchess Marie used all her influence. But Nicholas II, strongly influenced by his devout and rigid wife Alex, firmly refused. Alex would not tolerate a second Ducky scandal, especially with her brother-in-law. The marriage was forbidden outright. For Beatrice, this was a devastating shock. She had found a great love. A love also, it was a perfect marriage in terms of status, and it was taken away from her. Not for lack of love, but because of an ancient church rule. She was deeply hurt. Her heart was broken. This bitter, formative experience cemented a dangerous belief in her mind. Rules, whether royal, church, or social, are the enemy of individual happiness. She lost her first love because she tried to follow the rules. She won't make that mistake again. She was in her 20s, radiantly beautiful, but also cynical and defiant. Her sister Missy was a queen. Her sister Ducky was a rebel in love. And she, Beatrice, was a heartbroken survivor, still searching. Good marriages were proposed. German princes, English nobles. She rejected them all. They were too boring, too safe, too passionless. Her mother grew increasingly desperate. Baby B, her beautiful youngest child, was about to become stock. And then, on a fateful trip to Spain to visit her cousin, Queen Ina, Beatrice was introduced to a man who would change her life forever. He was not a bland German prince. He was not a forbidden Romanov cousin. He was something else entirely. He was an Infante of Spain. His name was Alfonso of Orléans-Bourbon, and he was the embodiment of dangerous romance. He was a soldier, a pilot, and the man who would lead her to glory and utter ruin. He was, in every sense, the antidote to her previous heartbreak. The man she met at the Spanish court was not a hesitant, duty-bound cousin. He was Infante Don Alfonso de Orleans y Bourbon, Duke of Galliera, a prince of Spain, a cousin to the reigning king, Alfonso XIII. To understand the magnetic pull he had on Beatrice, you have to understand who he was. He was not a prince in the mold of her English or German relatives, men who were defined by their roles as landowners or constitutional figures. Alfonso, known as Ali to his friends, was a modern man, a man of action. He was, first and foremost, a soldier, but his true passion was in the sky. He was one of Spain's pioneering aviators, a daredevil who had learned to fly in France and had become a national hero for his exploits. He was tall, impossibly handsome, with the dark, aristocratic features of the Spanish Bourbons, and possessed a legendary charm that was spoken of in every salon in Europe. He was worldly, exciting, and dangerous. Beatrice, now in her early 20s, was visiting her first cousin, Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, who had recently and controversially become Queen Ina of Spain. Ina was the daughter of Beatrice's aunt, another Princess Beatrice. She too had been a Protestant princess who had converted to Catholicism to marry King Alfonso XIII. Her life had been a trial from the moment she arrived. She was blamed for bringing the dreaded royal disease, hemophilia, into the Spanish line, and she was already being treated as an outcast by the court. Her wedding day itself had been shattered by an anarchist bomb, which had killed dozens of people in the street and splattered her wedding dress with blood. This was the court Beatrice entered, a place of immense ancient grandeur, but also of simmering violence, extreme religious piety, and suspicion of all things foreign. It was into this electric, high-stakes atmosphere that Infante Alfonso, the king's dashing cousin, walked. The connection between him and Baby B was, by all accounts, immediate and explosive. He was not interested in the demure, heavily chaperoned Spanish infantas. He was captivated by this English-German princess with her passionate Coburg spirit, her independent mind, and her striking, soulful beauty. And Beatrice, who had been mourning her forbidden Russian love and fending off proposals from dull, landed princes, was utterly swept off her feet. Here, at last, was the great romantic hero she had been waiting for. Here was her sister Ducky's grand passion. Here was a man who felt like an equal, a man whose charisma matched her own. They fell with a reckless and defiant speed madly in love. It was not a quiet courtship, it was a conflagration. But if her first love, Grand Duke Misha, had faced an insurmountable wall, this new love faced an entire mountain range of obstacles. Every single person in power was against them. Obstacle 1, the King of Spain. King Alfonso XIII was a man who demanded absolute loyalty and obedience. He was an autocrat in his court, if not entirely in his country. He was also Infante Alfonso's cousin, guardian, and commander-in-chief. And he had other plans for his cousin. He had already selected a suitable bride, a princess from his own approved list. He saw this sudden romance with a foreign non-Catholic princess as an act of rank insubordination. When Infante Alfonso went to his king and announced his intention to marry Beatrice, the king didn't just refuse, he exploded. He forbade the match. When the Infante, as stubborn and passionate as Beatrice herself, refused to back down, the king brought down the full weight of his authority. He stripped his cousin of his titles, his honors, and his military rank. He then did what kings do to disobedient relatives. He banished him from Spain. Obstacle 2, the families. On Beatrice's side, the reaction was one of pure panic. Her mother, the formidable Russian Orthodox Duchess Marie, was appalled. Not only was this another rebellious love match, but it was with a Roman Catholic. To the daughter of a Tsar, this was anathema, a betrayal of the true faith almost as bad as marrying a commoner. She saw her daughter, who had failed to secure the heir to Russia, now throwing herself away on a disgraced, penniless, and, in her eyes, unreliable Spanish prince. In England, the reaction was equally cold. Her uncle, the worldly King Edward VII, who understood the political complexities of Europe better than anyone, strongly advised against it. He knew it would cause a diplomatic and religious nightmare. After his death in 1910, her cousin, King George V, a man who despised scandal and religious ambiguity, would be even colder. A British princess, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, going to Rome, was not just a family problem. It was a public relations disaster, a poke in the eye to the Church of England, of which he was the head. Obstacle 3, the church, the colossal wall. This was the true barrier. Spain was not England or Germany, where religious rules could be bent for dynastic convenience. Spain in the early 20th century was still in spirit the Spain of the Inquisition. The power of the Catholic Church was absolute, woven into the very fabric of the monarchy and the state. The Spanish court was dominated by black-clad priests and ancient, unforgiving duchesses. For a Spanish Infante, a prince of the blood, to marry a Lutheran, a heretic in their eyes, was not just scandalous, it was unthinkable. It was a spiritual pollution of the most sacred bloodline in Europe. The law was explicit. To marry a non-Catholic without a special dispensation was to forfeit all rights, titles, and proximity to the throne. The families argued. The king raged. The church stood firm. They all presented Beatrice with an ultimatum: give him up, return to Coburg, be a good girl, and we will find you a suitable, wealthy, Protestant German prince. They had all fatally underestimated her. They had forgotten who she was. She was the sister of Ducky, the rebel who had divorced a Grand Duke and married another, and who was now living in defiant, loving exile. She was the woman who had lost her first great love, Misha, by obeying these very rules. Beatrice, now 25, looked at the array of forces against her, the King of Spain, the King of England, her mother, the Pope, and made her choice. She had learned her lesson. Rules were the enemy of the heart. This was her passion. This was her one life, and she would not be denied a second time. If the world would not bend for her, she would break with the world. She made the decision that in the eyes of her family and her country was the most profound betrayal of all. She announced that she would renounce her Lutheran faith. She would convert to Roman Catholicism. This was a monumental act. In an era when religious identity was political identity, this was a spiritual defection. For her English family, it was a source of deep shame. For her mother, it was a tragedy. For Beatrice, it was simply the price of admission. It was the sacrifice she had to make for love. Having made her choice, the couple was now united against the world. They were both in exile. He had been banished from Spain. She was now in spirit banished from her Protestant homeland. On the 15th of July, 1909, they were married. The wedding was not a grand state affair at St. James's Palace or a celebratory gathering in Madrid. It was a small, defiant, and politically charged ceremony held in a Catholic church in Coburg. Beatrice's mother, the Duchess Marie, swallowed her pride and attended, but it was a cold affair. The King of Spain pointedly refused to attend. So did the senior members of the British royal family. It was a wedding almost entirely devoid of the official royal support that should have surrounded a princess of her rank. She was, as one contemporary noted, a bride of great beauty, but with no kingdom to claim her. Beatrice was now officially Infanta of Spain, but she was an infanta with no country to be an infanta in. She and Alfonso were exiles, pariahs, with no court to welcome them and no official income. They lived in Coburg, dependent on the frosty hospitality of Beatrice's mother. The early years of their marriage were, in effect, a long, awkward house party they couldn't leave. The romantic dream had been achieved, but the reality was cramped and humiliating. They were two of the most high-ranking royals in Europe, and they were living like poor relations. Beatrice, who had been raised in palaces in Malta, England, and Germany, was now a princess in name only, stuck in her childhood home, her dashing husband grounded, his wings clipped by royal decree. This uncomfortable limbo lasted for 3 years. In that time, Beatrice gave birth to their first son, Alvaro, in 1910. The birth of an heir, a new generation of Spanish Bourbons, began to soften the edges of the family feud. Back in Madrid, King Alfonso XIII had his own problems. His wife, Queen Ina, Beatrice's cousin, had given birth to a son, the heir to the throne, who was, as feared, a hemophiliac. The court was in turmoil, and the king's own reputation was suffering. He was a notorious philanderer, and his subjects were growing restless. Perhaps he felt a pang of guilt. Perhaps he simply realized that the continued exile of his popular war hero cousin was bad for his own public relations. In 1911, the king finally relented. He made a grand gesture of reconciliation. He restored Infante Alfonso's titles and rank. And most importantly, he invited the couple to return to Spain. For Beatrice, it must have felt like the ultimate vindication. She had been right all along. She had defied them all. She had held firm, and she had won. She had her husband. She had her son. And now the gates of the kingdom were swinging open for her. She was about to make her grand entrance into the Spanish court, not just as a visitor, but as one of its highest-ranking princesses, the Infanta of Spain. She packed her bags, said goodbye to the gray skies of Coburg, and prepared to step into the sunlight. She had no way of knowing that she was not entering a dream, but the grand, gilded, and suffocating cage that would slowly and publicly destroy her. Beatrice's arrival in Madrid was, at first, a triumph. She was 27 years old, at the absolute height of her beauty, dressed in the latest Parisian fashions. She was the exotic, glamorous Inglesa who had tamed the king's rebellious cousin. She and Alfonso were given a residence in Madrid, a sign of their full restoration to royal favor. She quickly gave birth to 2 more sons, Alonso in 1912 and Ataulfo in 1913. She had done it. She had her dashing prince, she had 3 beautiful sons, and she was at the center of one of the oldest, grandest courts in Europe. On the surface, the rebellion had been a spectacular success, but the surface in Spain was a thin, brittle veneer. Beneath it, the reality of her new life began to set in, and it was cold, hard, and unforgiving. The Spanish court of Alfonso XIII was not the cosmopolitan, multilingual world of her Coburg childhood. It was a time capsule, a fortress of medieval tradition. It was a place where royalty was not just a rank, it was a priesthood. The court was dominated not by politicians or artists, but by a powerful, ultra-conservative aristocracy and the unbending power of the Catholic Church. Life was a relentless, suffocating ritual. The day was governed by religious observances. The etiquette was so formal that a simple greeting was a complex piece of choreography. And at its center was a king who, while a notorious womanizer in private, demanded an almost puritanical standard of public behavior from the women of his family. Beatrice, with her passionate Coburg spirit, her English education, her independent mind, and her foreign glamour, was never, ever truly accepted. She was and always would be the outsider, la inglesa, the convert, the woman who had trapped the Infante. The grand duchesses of the Spanish court, women who had spent their entire lives in the somber palaces of Madrid, looked at this vibrant, fashionable, and outspoken princess with deep suspicion. They whispered about her clothes, which were too modern. They whispered about her accent. They whispered about her conversion, which they saw as a matter of convenience, not true faith. She had followed the rules to get in, but she had none of their spirit. Her own sister, the worldly Queen Marie of Romania, came to visit her in Madrid and was absolutely horrified by what she found. The palace, she wrote, was oppressive and dead. She described the atmosphere of the court as one of fanatical piety, a place of endless, rigid rules that were enough to crush the life out of anyone. And she saw with a terrible sisterly clarity what this world was doing to baby B. The vibrant, passionate girl she had grown up with was disappearing. In her place was a woman who was becoming hard, brittle, and deeply unhappy. Marie saw her sister trapped in a world that was slowly, methodically suffocating her spirit. Beatrice was profoundly, terribly lonely. She had no real friends. Her only true ally in the court was her cousin, Queen Ina. But Ina was fighting her own battles, isolated and heartbroken over her son's illness and her husband's constant, humiliating infidelities. They were 2 foreign princesses clinging together for warmth in a court that had frozen them out. And the central pillar of Beatrice's life, the one thing she had sacrificed everything for, her great romance, was beginning to crumble into dust. The dashing aviator prince, Infante Alfonso, was not the man she thought she had married. Now that he had been restored to his rank and his home, the thrill of the forbidden romance was gone, and the reality of his character was laid bare. First and most pressingly, he was a catastrophic spendthrift. He had a taste for unimaginable luxury that far outstripped his allowance. But worse, he was a gambler, not with cards, but with business. He saw himself as a great entrepreneur. He was constantly embarking on a series of wild-eyed, grandiose business ventures, investing in everything from speculative real estate in North Africa to miraculous tonics to experimental aircraft, and he funded these schemes with her money. Beatrice's dowry, a substantial fortune from her Russian mother and English father, was supposed to secure their future. Instead, Alfonso poured it, year after year, into a black hole of failed projects. Beatrice, a woman raised in the dual wealth of the Russian and British empires, A woman who had never once in her life had to think about money suddenly found herself drowning in a sea of debt. The humiliation was overwhelming. They were hounded by creditors. Letters arrived daily. Men in sober suits would wait at the palace gates. They were forced to sell off assets quietly to cover the margins. Her jewels, her art even, it was said, the furniture from their grand residence. The scandal of the Infante's debts became the talk of Madrid, but the financial problems were just a symptom of a deeper, more painful crack in the marriage. The Infante Alfonso, her great romantic hero, was a restless, emotionally distant, and increasingly absent husband. He was rarely home. He was always at his flying clubs or on business trips or at his military barracks. His passion, it seemed, was for everything but his wife. He was a man's man, more comfortable in the barracks and the cockpit than in the formal female-dominated world of the court. And here, in this emotional vacuum, the whispers began. The whispers that would come to define their marriage and ultimately destroy Beatrice's reputation. They started in the hothouse atmosphere of the Madrid court, where every glance was analyzed, every absence noted. The rumors were that the Infante's passionate friendships with his fellow officers and business partners were not entirely platonic. While there is no concrete proof, no diary or letter that confirms it, the persistent, decades-long rumors of his bisexuality or homosexuality grew so loud that they became an open secret. In a hyper-macho, deeply Catholic culture like Spain, this was the ultimate taboo, a secret that had to be guarded at all costs. We cannot know for certain what Beatrice knew, but it is hard to believe she was entirely blind. She was an intelligent, perceptive woman. She would have felt the emotional distance, the lack of intimacy, the preference for male company. For Beatrice, this would have been the final devastating betrayal. This was the man she had sacrificed her faith for. This was the man she had alienated her family for. This was the man for whom she had endured the scorn of an entire nation. And now she was left utterly alone in a foreign country, publicly humiliated by debt, and privately starved of the very passion and affection that had been the entire point of the sacrifice. She was 40 years old. The life she had fought for was a lie. But Beatrice was a Coburg. She was the daughter of the Grand Duchess Marie and the sister of Queen Marie and Ducky. She was not a woman to fade quietly into the wallpaper, weeping over her prayer book. She was proud, she was passionate, and she was deeply, furiously angry. Beatrice was a Coburg. She was the daughter of the Grand Duchess Marie Alexandrovna and the sister of Queen Marie and the rebel Ducky. She was not a woman to simply accept this slow, suffocating martyrdom in a court that despised her. She was not her cousin, the long-suffering Queen Ina, who would endure a lifetime of her husband's public humiliations with a pained, pious smile. Beatrice was a creature of passion, pride, and ferocious emotion. If her husband would not love her, if the court would not respect her, she would not simply fade into the tapestries. And so in her loneliness, her anger, and her profound aching disappointment, she began to live her own life. She did it with the same defiant, reckless passion that had led her to this point. If her husband was to be the center of his own world, she would be the center of hers. This is when the scandal, the one that would provide the final justification for her expulsion, truly exploded. The Spanish court, already primed to believe the worst of La Inglesa, began to whisper. The whispers turned into a roar. The Infanta, they said, was having flirtations. She was indiscreet. She was attending private parties without her husband. She was seen laughing too freely, dancing too closely. In the rigid, almost monastic world of Queen Ina's circle, this was already a grave sin. But the rumors did not stop at flirtation. They coalesced around one specific and utterly catastrophic accusation that the Infanta had taken a lover. We will never know the truth. We will never know if this was a desperate grasp for human connection, a calculated act of revenge, or simply the malicious, xenophobic gossip of a court that had despised her from the moment she arrived. But in this world, the rumor was the conviction. The truth was irrelevant. The story that circulated was that her lover was not some obscure artist or bohemian, but a high-ranking member of the king's own staff, a man from the very heart of the court. This was not merely an act of infidelity, it was a political betrayal, a breach of the inner sanctum. It was a humiliation of her husband, Infante Alfonso, and by extension a profound insult to his cousin and sovereign, the king himself. King Alfonso XIII was, by every historical account, one of the most prolific royal philanderers of the 20th century. His life was a constant tapestry of mistresses, affairs, and illegitimate children, a fact that was an open secret in Madrid, and a source of constant pain for his wife, Queen Ina. But the hypocrisy of the era and of that court was absolute. He was the king. He was a man. His indiscretions were a sign of his virility, an expected if tiresome royal perk. Beatrice was a woman, and she was a foreigner. Her sin was not the act itself. Her sin was her failure to be invisible. Her sin was her refusal to suffer in dignified, pious silence. In a court that valued above all else the outward appearance of morality, Beatrice's indiscretion, whether real or imagined, was public. Her debts were public. Her unhappiness was public. Her failing marriage was public. She had failed in the one singular sacred duty of a royal woman, to be a silent, respectable, and unimpeachable prop for the monarchy. King Alfonso XIII, a man already incensed by his cousin's financial recklessness, now had the moral justification he needed. Beatrice was not just a financial liability. She was a moral contagion. She was a disgrace to the sacred name of the Bourbon dynasty. The final break came in the mid-1920s. The debts were insurmountable. The marriage was a hollow, bitter shell. The scandal was, by now, irreversible. Infante Alfonso, perhaps seeking to regain his own standing with the king, or perhaps just as weary of the fight as she was, agreed to a formal separation. In Catholic Spain, in the royal family, this was the ultimate sin. Divorce was illegal and unthinkable. A formal public separation was a tacit admission of total failure, a public rejection of the sacred vows of the Church and the unity of the crown. King Alfonso XIII had had enough. He saw Beatrice as the root of the problem, the foreign, willful, Protestant-born woman who had corrupted his cousin, bankrupted him, and brought disgrace to his court. He acted with the swift and brutal finality of an absolute monarch. He formally banished both of them from Spain. He stripped Infante Alfonso once again of his titles and honors, and he declared Princess Beatrice, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, persona non grata. She was cast out. Imagine that moment. She was now in her early 40s. The life she had sacrificed her faith, her family, and her fortune for was over. She was ordered to pack her bags, take her children, and leave. There was no negotiation, no appeal. It was a royal decree. She was being expelled from the nation she had tried for over a decade to make her home. The humiliation was total. She fled to the one place on earth she thought she could call home, the one place where her rank was not dependent on a resentful king or a failed marriage, the one place where she was by birth a princess. She fled to England. She arrived in London in the mid-1920s. a refugee from a different kind of war. She was a British-born princess, the daughter of a British Duke of the blood royal. Her cousin, King George V, was on the throne. She was family. She must have expected, if not a warm embrace, then at least a safe, quiet refuge. She would have expected sanctuary. What she received was a second and perhaps even more devastating rejection. Beatrice had once again misjudged the world she was walking into. The England she returned to was not the England of her childhood. The glittering, worldly, and morally flexible court of her uncle, the great bon vivant King Edward VII, was a distant memory. That world, with its casual affairs and continental sophistication, had been burned away in the fires of the First World War. The New England was the England of King George V, and more importantly, Queen Mary. This new court was the very antithesis of her passionate, chaotic Coburg family. George and Mary were rigid, dutiful, and morally austere. They were the very model of British middle-class respectability, transplanted onto a throne. Their court was not a place of glamour and passion. It was a place of quiet, unshakable routine, of duty, and of a profound, almost religious sense of decency. The king and queen had spent the last decade engaged in a massive, difficult project, saving the British monarchy. They had seen what happened to their cousins in Russia, Germany, and Austria. They had seen thrones topple. They had built a fortress wall around their own, and the mortar of that wall was respectability. And then Beatrice, baby B, arrived on their doorstep, a whirlwind of European scandal. To George, and especially to Mary, Beatrice was not a victim to be pitied. She was a living, breathing embodiment of everything they had tried to erase. First and most unforgivably, she was a scandal. She was a separated woman, a bolter, a failed wife. She was trailing lurid rumors of debt, disgrace, and infidelity. In the eyes of the deeply devout Queen Mary, who had famously refused to even speak to Beatrice's divorced sister Ducky for years, this was the ultimate social sin. In Queen Mary's world, your husband's behavior was irrelevant. A woman's job, her duty was to endure. Beatrice had not endured. She had, in a very public and messy way, failed. Second, she was a German. This cannot be overstated. The psychological trauma of the Great War had left a deep, virulent strain of anti-German sentiment in Britain. King George V himself had famously in 1917 shed his own German name, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, in a brilliant act of public relations. He had adopted the solidly English name Windsor. And now, here was his cousin Beatrice, arriving in London and still officially styling herself Her Royal Highness Princess Beatrice of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Her very name was a toxic, embarrassing reminder of the Hun they had just finished fighting. She was a living ghost of the family's German past, a past the Windsors were desperate to bury. Third, she was a bad Coburg. Her own family was radioactive. Her sister Ducky was living in exile after her scandalous divorce and her marriage to a Russian Grand Duke, a Romanov, the family now synonymous with the bloody, terrifying Bolshevik Revolution. Her other sister, Queen Marie, was seen as wildly eccentric and un-English. The entire Coburg branch, in the eyes of the staid Windsors, was unstable, continental, hysterical, and un-English. Beatrice was not welcomed back into the fold. She was radioactive. The king and queen, of course, did not cast her out onto the street. That would have caused a scandal of a different kind. But they made their displeasure known in the quiet, brutal way of the British aristocracy. She was given no official residence. There was no grace and favor apartment at Kensington Palace or St. James's. She was not put on the civil list or given any official duties. She was, in effect, a non-person. She became a poor relation. She, a granddaughter of an emperor and a queen, was forced to live in a series of rented houses in Kensington, dependent on the cold, carefully rationed charity of her English family. She was snubbed. She was not invited to the intimate family gatherings at Sandringham or Balmoral. She was perhaps invited to the vast, anonymous garden parties, but she was not part of the inner circle. She had become an embarrassment. She was now truly and completely the princess cast out by two courts, banished from Madrid for being a bad wife, and shunned in London for being a German scandal. Her loneliness during this period, from the mid-1920s to the early 1930s, must have been profound. It must have been a unique, surreal kind of hell. Imagine her walking through the London park she had known as a child, a city where she was by blood one of the highest-ranking women in the land. And yet she was invisible. She was a woman in her 40s, in the prime of her life with no role, no country, and no husband. She was a princess with no court. She had nothing to do but wake up, read the papers, and exist. She poured all of her thwarted passion, her intelligence, and her energy into the one thing she had left: her three sons, Alvaro, Alonso, and Ataulfo. They were her world. They were her justification. She was determined that they would succeed, that they would restore the family's honor. They were raised as Spanish Infante, living in exile in England, a strange hybrid identity that mirrored her own. And then as she was living this quiet life of social purgatory, the great historical wheel turned again. In 1931, the Spanish monarchy, which had seemed so unshakable, so permanent, collapsed. The Second Spanish Republic was declared. King Alfonso XIII, the same man who had sat in moral judgment of her, the same man who had banished her for bringing disgrace to his throne, was himself forced into a humiliating, chaotic exile. He fled the country on a warship, never to return. The news must have reached Beatrice in her rented house in Kensington. It is hard to imagine what she must have felt. But this grand historical vindication was a hollow one. It didn't give her back her life. It didn't restore her fortune. It didn't erase the years of loneliness. She was still a pariah in London, and the man who had been her husband was still her husband, now just another even poorer exile living in Rome. And then the ripples of Spain's collapse metastasized into something far darker. In 1936, the country she had once tried to call home exploded. The Spanish Civil War erupted. This was not for Beatrice a distant political conflict in the newspapers. This was a devastating personal catastrophe. The war was a brutal battle of ideologies. Franco's nationalists, a coalition of monarchists, fascists, and the church against the left-wing Republicans who were supported by communists and anarchists. For Beatrice and her family, there was no choice. The Republicans were the ones who had dismantled the monarchy. Worse, in their family's narrative, the Republicans were Reds, the same ideological force that had in 1918 herded her aunt, Tsarina Alexandra, and her cousins into a basement in Yekaterinburg and slaughtered them. The same force that had thrown her other aunt, the nun Ella, alive down a mine shaft. This was not a political war. It was a holy crusade. It was a battle against the very forces that had murdered her family. Her estranged husband, Alfonso, immediately threw his support behind General Franco, and her sons, raised as Spanish Infante, felt the call of their fatherland. Her middle son, Infante Alonso, was now 25 years old. He was idealistic, brave, and, like his father, a pilot. He saw his duty clearly. He volunteered for the Nationalist Air Force, joining a squadron to fight for Franco, for the restoration of his king, and for his God. For Beatrice, the anxiety must have been unbearable. Her son was going to war, but it was perhaps mixed with a dark pride. Her son was being the hero his father had only pretended to be. He was fighting to restore the family's honor. The war had barely begun. In September 1936, just a few months into the conflict, Alonso's plane was flying a mission over Republican territory. He was shot down. The news that came back was fragmented, then finally confirmed. Her son, her bright, brave boy, was dead, killed in action at the age of 25. This was the blow from which Beatrice would never, ever recover. This was the ultimate tragedy. It was a grief so profound it burned away all the petty, humiliating scandals of the past. What did it matter that Queen Mary snubbed her? What did it matter that her husband had wasted her money? What did it matter that she had been banished from Madrid? Her son was dead. She had lost her first love to the rules of the church. She had lost her marriage to scandal and betrayal. She had lost her home to exile. She had lost her reputation to gossip. And now she had lost her child to war. It was the final, cruelest act of a fate that seemed determined to take everything from her. The news reached her estranged husband, Alfonso, in his own exile. The death of their son was the one event, the one tragedy so immense that it transcended their years of bitterness, their debts, their betrayals. They were now united not by love but by the most profound and permanent bond of all, the shared, unquenchable grief of a lost child. This was the event that brought them back into each other's orbit. They were no longer fighting about money or affairs. They were two old, broken people mourning their son. As the 1930s drew to a close, the world was darkening. In 1939, Franco, backed by Hitler and Mussolini, won the Spanish Civil War. Spain was saved from communism, but it was now a grim, impoverished dictatorship. The new regime, however, was grateful to the Bourbons, who had supported its crusade. Infante Alfonso, the grieving father of a nationalist martyr, was a hero. His titles were restored. He was welcomed back, and he in turn extended his hand to his estranged wife. They were, in name, reconciled. They were a united front of grieving, patriotic parents. Beatrice, now 55 years old, was given permission to return to the country that had once cast her out. But what was she returning to? She was not returning to the glittering, opulent court of 1912. That world was gone forever. She was not returning as a celebrated infanta, but as a grieving, middle-aged mother. She was returning to a ruined, starving country, to live in a crumbling, sun-baked palace in the remote south of Spain, a place called Sanlúcar de Barrameda. And as she packed her bags in London, finally leaving the city that had offered her such a cold comfort, the rest of the world was once again about to ignite. It was 1939. Hitler was invading Poland. The Second World War had begun. The departure from London in 1939 was not a return. It was a final, quiet surrender. As Princess Beatrice packed up her rented house in Kensington, the life she had tried so desperately to build in England evaporated. She was 55 years old, a woman no longer defined by her beauty or her passion, but by her losses. She was, in the cold, clear light of her middle age, the sum of her tragedies. The world she was leaving was, once again, preparing for war. The newspapers on the day of her departure would have been filled with the news of Hitler's invasion of Poland, of Britain's grim, inevitable ultimatum. The world was, once again, splitting apart along the very fault lines that had defined her entire life, British versus German. But this time, she would not be a participant, not even as a reviled German in London. She was retreating to a third silent corner, the neutral, exhausted, and fascist-aligned Spain of General Franco. This was not a triumphant return to Madrid. Franco, while a monarchist at heart, was also a shrewd dictator. He was not about to restore the monarchy and give up his own power. King Alfonso XIII, the man who had banished her, remained in exile in Rome. The royal family was permitted to return, but not to rule. They were ghosts, welcome to haunt the nation they had once owned, but not to govern it. And Beatrice was not even returning to the heart of this shadow court. Her estranged husband, Infante Alfonso, his titles and estates restored by a grateful Franco, had chosen not to return to the political hornet's nest of Madrid. His ancestral seat was in the far south, in Andalusia. And so Beatrice, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria and Tsar Alexander II, traveled to a remote, sun-baked provincial town called Sanlúcar de Barrameda, a place famous for sherry, salt flats, and the heat of the African wind. She was returning to a man she had not truly lived with as a wife for over a decade. The reconciliation that had been forged in the crucible of their son's death was not a romantic one. It was not a rekindling of the great passion she had sacrificed her world for. It was instead a truce of the grieving, a grim, quiet partnership of two people bound not by love, but by a shared, incurable wound. The palace she arrived at was itself a perfect, crushing metaphor for her life. It was the vast, sprawling, ancestral palace of the Dukes of Galliera, but it was not a home. It was a sun-drenched tomb. It was a place of faded grandeur, of peeling gilt and cool, cavernous, marble-floored rooms that echoed with silence. The furniture was shrouded in dust covers. The vast art collection had been thinned out, sold off long ago to pay her husband's catastrophic debts. This was her new and final gilded cage. And the arrangement from the beginning was a stark reflection of their relationship. They were reconciled, but they were not together. Beatrice and Infante Alfonso established separate, parallel lives under the same vast roof. They reportedly took up residence in separate, distant wings of the palace. He had his life and she had hers. They were two lonely figures, rattling around in a house of memories and regrets, two ghosts haunting the same empty halls. For Beatrice, this final act of her life, this long, slow epilogue, was perhaps the cruelest. She was once again an exile, not from a country this time, but from life itself. The Second World War, which was consuming the rest of her family, was for her a distant, muffled roar. Spain was neutral. She was safe from the bombs that were, at that very moment, raining down on her English relatives in London. She was safe from the ideological inferno that had consumed her German family. But this safety was a form of entombment. She was completely, utterly cut off. Think of her position. Her British cousins, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, were the symbols of Allied resistance, visiting the bombed-out East End of London, becoming icons of British grit. To them, she was now not only the German relative who had bolted from her marriage, she was a woman living, by choice, in a friendly, fascist state, the sister-in-law of a de facto ally of Hitler. The gulf was no longer just social, it was political. The lines of communication went dead. And what of her German family? Her brother Charles Edward, the reigning Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, had not just been a passive supporter of the new regime. He was an early, ardent, and high-ranking Nazi. He was a general in the SA, the Brown Shirts. He was the president of the German Red Cross, a role complicit in implementing the horrific Nazi eugenics programs. His own children were deeply embedded in the Nazi Party. Beatrice was the sister of one of the most prominent Nazi royals in Germany. She was now triply damned in the eyes of her British family, a bolter from her marriage, a German by name, and now the sister of a high-ranking Nazi. There was no coming back from that. She was an island. Trapped in a neutral country, her English family saw her as a fascist sympathizer, Her German family was at war with her English family, and her Spanish family was a shattered wreck, licking its wounds from its own brutal civil war. She had no side. She had no people. She had only her grief and the suffocating silence of the palace. The 1930s and 40s were an avalanche of death, a systematic dismantling of her entire world. The process had begun even before she returned to Spain, hollowing her out, preparing her for this final quiet existence. First, in March 1936, her sister, her great role model in rebellion, Victoria Melita, had died of a stroke in France. Ducky had achieved her great love, marrying her Grand Duke Kirill, but the Bolshevik Revolution had destroyed them. They, too, had lived a life of exile and faded grandeur, with Kirill proclaiming himself Tsar in exile, a hollow title no one recognized. Ducky had died at 59, a broken, disillusioned woman. The first of the beautiful Coburg sisters was gone. Then just 6 months later, in September 1936, her own son Alonso was shot down and killed. Then less than 2 years later, in July 1938, her eldest sister, the Grand Queen Marie of Romania, had died. Missy, the most successful of them all, the one who had followed duty, had lived a spectacular operatic life. Her death marked the end of an era. Now only Beatrice and her quiet sister Sandra remained. The ghosts of her past were vanishing, one by one. In 1941, the news reached Sanlúcar. King Alfonso XIII, the man who had held her fate in his hands, the king who had banished her from Spain, had died in his own lonely exile in Rome. What must she have felt reading that telegram? It was not triumph. It was not joy. It was, one imagines, just a profound, cold, and bitter irony. He was just another ghost. The man who had judged her so harshly for failing her sacred duty had himself died a failure, a king without a kingdom, buried in a foreign land, having been forced to abdicate his throne to his son, Don Juan. The entire rigid, hypocritical system that had judged her and crushed her had, in the end, destroyed itself. But this grand historical vindication was a hollow one. It didn't give her back her life. It didn't restore her fortune. And it did not bring back her son. While the world was fighting from Stalingrad to the beaches of Normandy, Beatrice's life shrank to the borders of her garden. She poured her thwarted energy into the grounds of the palace. She became a passionate, expert gardener. It was a fitting, poignant metaphor. She who could not control the world, who could not control her husband, who could not save her son, could at least control this. She could bring life, order, and beauty to this small patch of Spanish earth. She could cultivate her garden just as Voltaire had advised, in the face of an absurd and meaningless world. Her husband, Infante Alfonso, lived his parallel life. He too was an old man now. The firebrand aviator was gone. He busied himself with the management of his estates, with his clubs, with his own circle of friends. He was a constant yet distant presence in the house. They were two strangers, bound by a shared address and a shared gravestone for their son. This was the final cold reality of the great passion she had sacrificed everything for. It was not a fire. It was not even embers. It was just cold, cold ash. Then, in 1945, the great global convulsion ended. The Second World War was over. The Allies had won. The mushroom clouds over Japan had ushered in a new, terrifying atomic age. For Beatrice, the end of the war brought one final public humiliation for her family. Her brother, Charles Edward, the Nazi Duke of Coburg, was arrested by American troops. He was not treated as a royal, but as a high-ranking Nazi official. He was tried by a denazification court. He was found guilty, stripped of his lands, his fortune, and his very identity. He was imprisoned, a broken, reviled old man, dying in poverty. The name Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the name Beatrice still bore, was now not just German. It was, in the eyes of the victorious world, Nazi. Any faint, lingering hope she might have had of a reconciliation with her British family was now gone forever. She was the sister of a convicted Nazi. She was the final, absolute pariah. The doors to London were not just closed, they were locked, barred, and sealed. And so her life entered its final, long, and silent phase. The post-war world exploded with new life, with rock and roll, with the Cold War, with the jet age. But for Beatrice, time had stopped. She was frozen in 1936 with the death of her son. She lived as a recluse. Her world was the palace, her garden, her two surviving sons, Alvaro and Ataulfo, and their growing families. She found her only solace in being a grandmother. It was a quiet, private, and contained life. She would read, one imagines, of the great royal events of the post-war era. In 1947, the wedding of her distant cousin, Princess Elizabeth, to Philip of Greece. Philip, her other cousin's son. She would see the photographs of the new streamlined House of Windsor, a family she was now utterly and permanently excluded from. In 1953, she would read of the coronation, a new queen, a new age, and she was still in her dusty palace, in her hot garden, a living relic of an age so distant it might as well have been the 17th century. She grew old. The passionate, defiant beauty faded, replaced by the quiet, sad dignity of a woman who had survived everything and lost everything. She and her husband continued their strange, silent truce. Two old people in a vast, quiet house for decades. Her health began to fail. Her husband, ironically, remained robust. She was the one to decline first. In 1966, at the age of 82, Princess Beatrice of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Infanta of Spain, died in her palace at Sanlúcar. Her death was barely a ripple. It was a footnote in the international papers. Aunt of Queen Marie of Yugoslavia, Princess Beatrice, dies in Spain. Most people had no idea who she was. They had long forgotten the beautiful, scandalous baby bee. They had forgotten the princess cast out by two courts. She had outlived her era. She had outlived her glamour. She had outlived her scandals. Her husband, the man who had been the cause of it all, outlived her by almost a decade. She died as she had lived for half her life, in that state of cold, quiet, unresolved reconciliation, in a foreign land that was never truly her home. She, like her sister Ducky before her, rebelled for love, and she was perhaps the most tragic victim of that rebellion. The long, quiet, and profoundly sad life of Princess Beatrice of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha is more than just a forgotten royal biography. It is a story that resonates with the great, violent, and contradictory themes of the 20th century. Her life, which began in the absolute zenith of the Victorian age and ended in the anonymity of Franco's Spain, serves as a powerful human lens through which we can understand the collapse of an entire world. Beatrice's story is, first and foremost, a tragedy about the collision between the 19th century institution of royalty and the 20th century desire for a modern personal life. She and her sisters, particularly Ducky, were new women. They were raised in a unique cosmopolitan hothouse that made them intelligent, passionate, and fiercely independent. They were not content to be the quiet, dutiful brood mares that the system demanded. They believed in a very modern way in the right to personal happiness, to romantic love, and to passion. Her sister Ducky rebelled, and for a time she won. She found a true, if tumultuous, partnership. Beatrice tried to follow that same path. Her rebellion, however, was for an illusion. Her story is therefore a darker, more cautionary tale. It explores what happens when a woman raised for a gilded cage smashes the cage for a love that turns out to be hollow. It left her with nothing, no cage, no love, and no purpose. She was left to float, a ghost in a world that had no place for her. More than a personal story, Beatrice's life is a devastating allegory for the death of the pan-European aristocracy. She was born a product of three great empires, British, German, and Russian. Her blood was a map of the continent, but the First World War and the rabid nationalism it unleashed made her very existence a problem. That cosmopolitan identity, once her greatest asset, became her greatest liability. She was the ultimate collateral damage of nationalism. She was the German in England, a dangerous reminder of the enemy, her very name a slur. She was the English woman in Spain, the foreign heretic who could never be trusted. She was the Protestant in a Catholic court that viewed her as a spiritual contaminant. She was the Catholic convert her Protestant family viewed with deep suspicion. She was a woman who belonged to everyone and, in the end, to no one. She was a living testament to the fact that the old interconnected world of Queen Victoria was dead, and the new world of rigid borders and us versus them had no place for someone who was all of them at once. Her life is also a brutal, searing indictment of the hypocrisy of the patriarchal system she was trapped in. Beatrice was not a monster. Her sins were human ones. She was a failed wife. She was indiscreet. And she was a financial mess. But she was judged and cast out by a system run by men whose sins were far greater, yet who paid no price. King Alfonso XIII, a notorious philanderer who had dozens of affairs and illegitimate children, was the one who banished her for immorality. His concern was not for the sanctity of marriage, it was for the public embarrassment she caused by not suffering in silence. King George V, a man whose own father was a famous libertine and whose German name family was a source of constant political anxiety, was the one who shunned her as a scandal and a German. Her husband, Infante Alfonso, a man whose financial recklessness destroyed her fortune and whose own private life had arguably destroyed their marriage, was the one who was ultimately forgiven by the system. He was the one who had his titles and lands restored by Franco, while Beatrice was merely allowed to return as his appendage, his shadow. She was punished, not for any great crime, but for being a public failure and for being a woman. Her story is a perfect, painful example of the brutal gender double standard that ran through the aristocracy, where a woman's only duty was to be a silent, respectable facade for the men around her. Beatrice, with her passionate Coburg heart, was simply incapable of being a facade. Finally, her story is a reflection on the nature of survival. Unlike her aunts in Russia, she was not martyred. She was not, like her brother, a convicted Nazi. She was not, like her sisters, a grand queen or a famous rebel. Her fate was, in many ways, more subtle and more tragic. She was simply forgotten. She was forced to live with her losses, to endure decades of quiet, grinding loneliness. She survived the fall of the Russian, German, and Spanish monarchies. She survived 2 world wars. She survived the death of her son, but this survival was a form of living death, an exile in a sun-drenched palace, surrounded by the ghosts of the life she had fought for and the love that had betrayed her. Princess Beatrice, Baby B, began her life as one of the most brilliant jewels of the Victorian age. She was the product of 3 empires, a woman of dazzling beauty and a passionate, rebellious spirit. She, like her sisters, was determined to have it all, the rank of a princess and the heart of a woman. She wanted what she had been denied, a great world-defying love, and she got it. She fought for it. She sacrificed her faith for it, and she defied her family for it. But the price was absolute. She chose her heart over her duty, and in doing so, she became a woman without a home. The Spanish court she fought to enter banished her as a failure. The British court she fled to shunned her as a scandal. She was the princess cast out by two courts, a woman whose entire identity had been shattered by war, prejudice, and her own romantic rebellion. Her life is not a fairy tale. It is a haunting human story of profound loneliness. It's a story of what happens when the great cinematic passion you stake your entire existence on turns out to be an illusion. The man was a mirage, and the love was a lie. And that is her ultimate tragedy. It is not just that she was cast out, but that the reason for her rebellion was hollow, leaving her with absolutely nothing. She was left to wander, a ghost in her own life, through the ruins of the empires that had once defined her. She survived, but she was left with only the silence of her garden, the ghosts of the world she had lost, and the profound, quiet, and unresolved tragedy of a life that had promised so much and had been, in the end, so terribly, devastatingly empty.